is Language, Chapter 4, Lesson 10. And what this lesson deals with is 4 specific adjectives that are used to compare amounts, specifically when one thing has a smaller amount than something else. And those 4 words are fewer, fewest, less, and least. And there's 2 different instances where you would specifically use fewer or fewest versus less or least, and that's what this lesson is going to talk about. And one thing we'll have to do is decide which one is the appropriate one to use. So if you look at page 98, it says fewer, fewest, less, and least are used in comparing things. Fewer and fewest are used with plural count nouns. And what that means is count nouns are specific items, people, or things that you could actually physically count. Like you could count the amount of books on a shelf, or the amount of people in a room, or houses on the street. Things that you can actually physically count are plural count nouns. And so when you're comparing those types of things, that's when you would use fewer or fewest. Less and least, it says, are used with non-count nouns. And we're going to have some examples of those later on, but those are more things that they're still nouns, but they're more like an idea, something you can actually physically see or count, so it's hard to measure. And when you have those types of nouns and you're comparing them, that's when you use less or least. So if we go on to the next paragraph, it says, like we mentioned, count nouns name things that can be counted, such as players, games, and children, things you can actually count. Non-count nouns name things that cannot be counted, such as health, teamwork, patience. Those are things that you couldn't actually physically count, and there's no real way to measure them, and you can't, like, by actually counting them. So it says count nouns usually have a plural form ending in s to show that there's more than one, while non-count nouns do not. If you look back to those examples that they gave you, health, teamwork, patience, none of those end in s. It says, in these sentences, fewer and fewest are used with the plural count noun sports. And it gives us an example here. That park offers fewer sports than the one nearby. So they're comparing the sports that this park offers to one nearby. Or this park offers the fewest sports of all the city parks. So comparing the sports in this park to those in all the parks across town. Then it gives us an example of when we would use less and least. It says they're used with the non-count noun progress. We made less progress than the other team, meaning how much they improved, which is something you can't necessarily physically count, or there's no real way to measure that. But you can see if we made less progress, it means we weren't as good as the other team. Or we made the least progress of any team, comparing the progress of our team to those of all the other teams. If your team ended up being the worst team in the league, then you would probably say we made the least progress because all the other teams beat us. They did a better job than we did. So you've got a choice here in parentheses, and they want to know which of these would be the correct one to use based on the nouns that you're comparing. Blank students tried out for the team this year. Well, what we're comparing is how many students tried out, and that's something I can actually count. So if that's the case, I would say fewer students tried out, since it's something I can actually count. So before I can decide whether I should use fewer and fewest or less and least, I have to understand whether or not the noun that we're comparing is something I can actually physically count or not. So in exercise 1, that's what they ask us to do. Just say yes or no. Are these items, people, places that I could actually count, or is it more of an idea that I can't really count or measure? So we just have to say yes or no, can these nouns be counted? Number 1 is baseball, which is an item. Yes, I could count how many baseballs were in the bucket or in the bag. Number 2, health. And that's an example that they actually used up top to show us that that is a non-count noun. So health is not necessarily something you could actually physically count. 3, ballpark. Yes, I could count the number of ballparks that are in town. 4, league. I could count how many baseball leagues our city has. That's something I could count. Pitcher. I could definitely count how many pitchers the other team has. So that is something I could count. Pride is something that's more, again, of an idea, not something I can necessarily physically see or count. So that one would be no. Uniform is a thing, it's an item. I could count how many uniforms we have. Responsibility is another one of those things that I can't put a real necessarily measure on, so that one would be no. Score, I can definitely count and keep track of. And children, I could also count to see how many are there. So we ended up with very few that were actually no's, and that probably tends to be the case where there's more nouns that you're able to count than those weird non-count nouns that are more ideas. But let's take a look at what exercise 2 wants us to do on page 99. It says, first decide if each noun can be counted, then write phrases to show whether you should use fewer, fewest, less, or least with each noun. So, in other words, first I have to decide if it can be counted, and then I say which set I would use with them. Our first one is excitement. That is not something that I could really count or measure. So if that's the case, I would use less or least, depending on what the sentence said. Number 2, cloud. Those are items in the sky that I could sit there and count if I wanted to. So that would mean I would use fewer or fewest. Maybe I'll just write L or F since it's being tricky on me here. Number 3, bat. And I think here they're talking about baseball bats, since that's what we've been talking about the whole time. Those are definitely items that I could count. So in that case, I would use fewer or fewest. Number 4 is humidity. That's something where they do have a scale that they can say that there's this percentage of humidity in the air, but to actually look at it and count it is not something I can do. So there, I would say there's less humidity than there was yesterday, or least of all the week. Number 5, tickets are items that I can count, so I would use fewer or fewest there. Energy is not something I could physically count, so I would say I have less energy than I did yesterday, or she has the least energy out of anyone. Number 7, coach is something I could definitely count how many coaches a team has. So in that case, I would say we have fewer coaches than they do. 8 is knowledge, and that is again something that I can't really physically count. So I could say I have less knowledge about this than I do about that. Or I have the least knowledge about this subject. So in exercise 3 then, they're putting this into real world situation now where they give me a sentence and I have to look at what noun it is that we're comparing. Is it something I can count or not, to decide which sentence or which word completes the sentence correctly. So, number 1, Our team has won blank games this year than last year. So here we're comparing the amount of games that we won, which is something I can count. So I would say we've won fewer games. Number 2, however, the team across town still had the blank support in our league. Here, we're comparing the amount of support, which is not something I could necessarily count. So I would say they have the least support. Number 3, we have blank good hitters this year than last. Here, I'm comparing the amount of good hitters that we have, which I could count how many people on our team are good hitters. So I would say fewer there. Number 4, we have had blank time for practice this year. Here, yes, time is something that's measurable, but when I'm out there practicing, can I actually physically, unless I'm looking at my watch, I guess, I can't see the time in front of me and count how many there are. So in this case, they would say we have less time. Number 5, there was blank cold last year than this year. Again, not something I can really see and count, so we would say there was less cold. Number 6, we've scored blank runs this year. We're comparing the amount of runs we scored this year to last. That is something I could go back and count, so we would say fewer there. Number 7, in fact, we've scored the blank runs of all the teams in the league. Here, I could look at all the runs that every team has scored, and I could count them, so we would say the fewest runs. And number 8, our best pitcher, Sophia, has allowed the blank hits of all the pitchers in the league. Here, you could go and look at how many hits each pitcher has allowed and count them out. So you could say she's allowed the fewest hits. So if we take a peek at the workbook page real quick, it's page 65. What they're asking you to do on the top section is a lot like exercise 2, where you say yes or no. Can I? Here it says, can you see, touch, and count it? And that's kind of a good way to look at it. If it is something I can see, something I can touch, then probably I can count it. And so that's a good way to think about it. So you say yes or no for that, and then you write how you would compare that. So for example, I didn't write this all out because my pen was being goofy, but number 1 in exercise 2 was excitement, which was not something we could count. We put no for that first part. So then in that chart, I would put less excitement or least excitement. And so there's 3 answers in this chart on page 65, and that's what you do. So in the first column, you would write either fewer or less with it, and then fewest or least with it in that third column. Then in the second part, you fill in the blank with those choice of 4 words, less, least, fewer, or fewest, that fits correctly in the sentence. So you'll have to look and see what is it that you're comparing to decide which one of those is correct to use. And then in the last section, it says write a sentence for each noun using less, least, fewer, or fewest. So you have to write a sentence about the noun that they give you there and use either less, least, fewer, or fewest somewhere in that sentence that you write.